Before writing, before kingdom, before medicine, did people care for the vulnerable? What happens when a child is born different in a world where survival is already brutal? This is not just a question of archaeology, it's a question of humanity. Picture this. 50,000 years ago, there are no doctors, no diagnosis, no shelters with warm lighting or waiting hands. Only the raw edge of existence, the crackling wind, the bark of hyenas in the dark, the endless need to move, to hunt, to gather, to survive. Every member of the group must contribute, or risk being left behind. And yet imagine a child, born with a different face, softer features, almond-shaped eyes, a heart that may beat slower, lungs that struggle in the cold night air, and muscles that never grow quite strong enough to match the others. Could this child have survived? Should they have? It's a brutal question, but it's one we must ask if we want to understand who we really are and who we've always been. For generations, the assumption was simple. Ancient life was too harsh, too demanding, too merciless to allow anyone with a disability to live, especially a genetic condition like Down syndrome, which affects physical development, cognitive function, and immune response. Survival in the Paleolithic was a narrow path walked on a razor's edge. Every extra mouth to feed, every slowed pace, every illness or injury could mean death for the group. So surely such a child would be abandoned. And yet, bones tell a different story. Archaeology, like time itself, does not speak in words. It whispers in fractures and fossils, in burial positions and cranial anomalies, in the absence of teeth and the healed breaks of ancient bones. And sometimes those whispers reveal something extraordinary. In 2023, in the rolling hills of northern Spain, archaeologists uncovered a burial in a cave called La Noguera. The skeleton was that of a child no more than 6 years old. Their skull bore the unmistakable markers of trisomy 21, the genetic anomaly that causes Down syndrome. There was no sign of violence, no trauma, only care. They had been buried intentionally. That single act, placing a body into the earth with deliberate hands, suggests recognition, grief, community, love. That child had been fed, protected, carried and mourned. In a time when survival was counted in hours, someone, perhaps many, had made a different choice, not to discard the weak, but to carry them forward. This is not an isolated case. Decades earlier, in the shadowed recesses of Shannidar cave in Iraq, scientists found the remains of a Neanderthal man known as Shannidar 1. He was blind in one eye, partially deaf with a crippled arm and a limp. He lived into his 40s, unheard of at the time, and his injuries had healed long before death. He had been cared for. These are not just anecdotes. They are pieces of a pattern, a buried history of compassion stretching back far beyond cities and civilization. We think of ancient people as primitive, ruled by brute instinct. But what if they were more nuanced than we give them credit for? What if the very traits we pride ourselves on, empathy, cooperation, inclusion, are not modern at all but prehistoric? What if the first kindness is older than the first tool? So we ask again, in a world of predators and ice, of famine and fear, did people care for those born different? Not out of utility, not for gain, but because something in them saw another human being, not a burden, not a problem, but a person. This isn't just archaeology, it's memory, buried not in history books, but in the soil beneath our feet. And as we sift through it, layer by layer, we're not just uncovering the past, we're uncovering ourselves. Because to ask whether a child with Down syndrome was loved 50,000 years ago is to ask what it means to be human. And the answer, if we're brave enough to listen, might just surprise us. What is Down syndrome? A prehistoric perspective. You know the name, Down syndrome, a modern term named after a 19th century physician, John Langdon Down, who described its traits in a time when genetics was still a mystery. Today we understand it well. It's caused by an extra copy of the 21st chromosome, trisomy 21, a random genetic event that reshapes development in subtle and visible ways. It affects physical growth, cognitive ability, facial features, and sometimes the heart or immune system. But the syndrome is not new. It didn't arrive with cities or science. It is as old as humanity itself, and perhaps older still. DNA is the language of time. It writes stories in every cell, and stories that stretch back millennia. And this particular story, the one written by that extra chromosome, didn't begin in hospitals or clinics. It began in caves, on open plains, around flickering fires in the Ice Age. The child born with trisomy 21 in a Paleolithic band would not have had a name for their condition. There was no diagnosis, no explanation, no prenatal tests, only difference and recognition. Their face might have looked subtly unfamiliar. The curve of the eyes, the flatter bridge of the nose, the softness of their muscles. Their reactions slower, their milestones delayed. But would their people have known what that meant? Or would they have simply seen a child? Different, yes, but still theirs. Modern science tells us that the cognitive impacts of Down syndrome vary widely. Some individuals today live independently. Others require lifelong support. In a modern world built on technology, speed and competition, we measure value through productivity. But Paleolithic societies measured value differently. In a small band of 20 or 30 individuals, everyone mattered. Everyone was known by name, by face, by voice. The child was never anonymous. And so if that child with Down syndrome smiled slowly, if they learned to walk a year later than others, if they struggled to keep up on long migrations, they were still seen, still carried, still included. From an evolutionary standpoint, the existence of Down syndrome, despite its biological cost, is striking. Geneticists have found evidence of trisomy 21 in ancient remains going back thousands of years. This suggests that even with its challenges, this condition persisted across time and geography. Why? Because sometimes biology makes space for something deeper. Because humans from our earliest days weren't just survivors. We were social creatures, storytellers, caretakers. The traits we associate with Down syndrome today, warmth, emotional intelligence, empathy, may have found a place even in harsh environments. The child may not have been a tracker or a hunter, but perhaps they were a comfort to their mother, a focus of shared effort, a bearer of stories. Perhaps they mattered in ways science cannot measure. In the modern world we classify and diagnose, we separate difference from norm. But in the world before words, how were these differences understood? Maybe they weren't. Maybe they were just felt. A slower heartbeat, a gentler pace, a child whose eyes held wonder longer than the others. In a world before definitions, there was only experience. And in that experience, raw, unfiltered, and ancient, we find the roots of compassion. Down syndrome is not a condition of modern life. It is a human story, a prehistoric one, and it reminds us that difference has always walked beside us, not as an enemy but as a mirror, the harsh reality of prehistoric life. In a world where every day was a fight for survival, where food was scarce and mobility was essential, how did anyone with a disability survive? The assumption has long been that they didn't, but evidence is beginning to say otherwise. Survival for our Paleolithic ancestors was not a lifestyle. It was a sentence, a constant trial. Each sunrise brought new hunger. Each step held the risk of a twisted ankle, a predator's eyes, a drop in temperature that could turn breath into ice. In this world, this raw, unfiltered world, nothing was guaranteed. Not fire, not food, not tomorrow. Mobility wasn't a convenience, it was law. When the herd moved, you followed. When water dried up, you left. When the weather turned, you ran or froze. And in such a world, what place was there for weakness? For delay? For disability? The answer for decades was silence. Historians and anthropologists assumed the worst, that the child born with a difference, with Down syndrome or any other visible condition, was simply left behind. That in a world ruled by survival of the fittest, compassion was a luxury no one could afford. But buried in that silence, bones began to speak. At first they whispered, a healed fracture here, a spinal deformity there. But the individual survived long enough to heal, long enough to leave a mark. Then more stories emerged. In the Shannidar cave in northern Iraq, a Neanderthal man, maimed and partially blind, lived well into his 40s. His arm had been amputated at the elbow. He had severe hearing loss, and yet he lived. Someone fed him, guided him, watched over him. They didn't abandon him, they adapted to him. And in 2003, in a limestone cave in Spain, the silence shattered. A child's skeleton, around 6 years old. The bones bore clear signs of trisomy 21, a child with Down syndrome, alive in the Neolithic era, buried with care, not discarded, not erased, but remembered. How? How does a child who walks slowly, learns slowly, perhaps never speaks in full sentences, survive in a world that offers no margin for error? The answer may lie not in the body, but in the band. Prehistoric life was brutal, but it wasn't solitary. Humans didn't survive because we were the strongest. We survived because we were the most connected. Because we learned early on that 20 hands are better than 2, that a child carried on another's back is still a child worth keeping. That shared effort lightens every load. And perhaps, just perhaps, they saw something we forgot, that strength is not always speed or muscle. Sometimes it's the decision to care, to slow down, to carry someone who cannot walk fast, and still call it forward. The child with Down syndrome may not have fetched water, tracked deer, or knapped flint, but they laughed, they cried, they were part of stories, of songs, of evening fireside silences. They were human, and that was enough. We assume that the past was cruel, that only the useful survived. But the bones, those patient ancient witnesses, tell a different story. They tell us that even in the harshest conditions there was room for kindness. Not everywhere, not always, but enough. Enough to carry a child, enough to remember a face, enough to make a space in a world that rarely offered second chances. The truth is simple and astonishing. In the harshest life imaginable, humans still made space for those born different. And that, more than any stone tool or fire, may be our oldest innovation. The Shannidar cave and the first evidence of compassion. High in the rugged Zagros mountains of northern Iraq lies a cave. Quiet, cold, still. But some 45,000 years ago, it was a shelter, a refuge, a place where life and death etched their marks into stone, and buried deep in its dusty layers, archaeologists found something that would shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about Neanderthals, and about ourselves. They named him Shannidar I. He wasn't a modern human. He was a Neanderthal, stockier, with a pronounced brow ridge and robust bones. But his body told a story beyond species or science. It told a story of pain and survival. Shannidar I was in bad shape. He had suffered a blow to the head in childhood, which left him partially or fully blind in one eye. His right arm was withered and useless, possibly amputated at the elbow. His right leg showed signs of trauma, and his hearing may have been impaired. In a world where hunting, fleeing, and gathering were daily necessities, he was vulnerable, he was slower, weaker. And yet, he lived. Not for a day, not for a season, for over a decade after his injuries. That's a lifetime in prehistoric terms. This wasn't just survival, this was care. Someone must have helped him gather food. Someone shared meat with him, someone guided him through rough terrain. Someone protected him when predators stalked. Someone, or some group, decided he was worth the effort. Let that sink in. Because in the harsh logic of prehistoric survival, weakness is often assumed to be a death sentence. Efficiency is everything. Every mouth must contribute. Every body must move fast, fight hard, climb high. But here lies Shannidar I, cared for, not out of profit, not because he could be exploited, not because he was useful, because he was human. This single skeleton cracks open a door we thought was locked. It suggests that empathy, that most elusive and deeply human quality, predates civilization. It wasn't born in cities or carved into tablets or written in sacred texts. It may have lived in the hearts of Neanderthals huddled in caves, passing cooked marrow bones to a blind companion. The Shannidar cave becomes more than a burial site, it becomes a mirror. And we must ask, if Neanderthals could make room for the disabled, what does that say about us? Because for years Neanderthals were portrayed as brutes, club-wielding savages with no art, no language, no soul. But time has chipped away at that caricature, and skeleton by skeleton, evidence by evidence, they've started to look a lot like us, maybe even kinder than we gave them credit for. And if Neanderthals, long before medicine or philosophy, could demonstrate compassion, then the question grows louder. What did Homo sapiens do? Could we, with our sharper tools and bigger brains, show even greater care? Or have we, in our rush toward modernity, left something ancient and essential behind? The bones in Shannidar whisper across time, he mattered. Not because he was strong, not because he was fast, but because he was one of them, and they chose to keep him close. The child of La Noguera, Down syndrome in deep time. In the silent soil of La Noguera, a region in Catalonia, Spain, a Neolithic secret was unearthed. A child's skeleton, over 5,000 years old, tenderly buried among their people. But this wasn't just any child. The skull told a story etched in bone, features characteristic of Down syndrome, a condition caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, a genetic accident as old as humanity itself. The find, dated to around 300 BCE, sent quiet shockwaves through both the archaeological and medical communities. Not because Down syndrome was present, scientists already knew the condition existed in ancient times, but because of what it meant. This child had lived beyond infancy, likely for 6 or more years, in a time before hospitals, before therapy, before even written language. In a world where survival was a razor's edge, the child was not abandoned. They were kept warm, fed, protected, loved. The implications are staggering. Down syndrome can be accompanied by the medical complications, heart defects, weakened immunity, difficulty feeding. Even in the modern world, early survival can be precarious. So how did a child with these challenges survive so long in the Neolithic? The answer, quietly echoed through millennia, is this: someone cared. Care doesn't fossilize. You cannot dig love from the earth or carbon date compassion. But you can read it in what remains, in worn teeth that show the child was nourished, in the lack of trauma on the bones, in the location and positioning of the burial. This child was not hidden away, not cast out. They were buried in the same way as others, in the same sacred ground, as one of them. And that rewrites something deep within our assumptions. For centuries we told ourselves a story about our ancestors, that they were brutal, cold, pragmatic, to the point of cruelty, that prehistoric life left no room for the weak or different, that evolution favoured only the strong, the fast, the fit. But the child of La Noguera whispers another version, that human survival was not built solely on dominance, but on inclusion. This burial is not the only case. Similar remains, from other time periods, other places, are beginning to accumulate, forming a quiet, archaeological chorus. Each one is a challenge to the old narrative. Each one says, even then we took care of each other. And so we come to a paradox. In the deep past, in a world more dangerous than we can imagine, compassion may have run deeper than we believed. The community that carried this child through the years of vulnerable life, who gave them shelter and a place in the burial ground, may not have used the word disability, but they practiced something profoundly human. The child may have never spoken. They may have moved differently, understood differently, but they were seen. They were kept close. In La Noguera, we are not just looking at a skeleton. We are looking at evidence of a society that made room for difference. A society that, against the odds, found a way to care. And perhaps that's not a story about the past. It's a mirror held up to us now. The role of community in ancient survival, in the sharp silence of a prehistoric forest or the wide openness of a Neolithic plain, one truth echoed louder than any predator's roar. Alone, you die. Survival in early human history wasn't driven by individual might or cleverness alone. It was held together by a fragile but powerful thread, community. Before governments, before God, before grain. There were only small groups, often no larger than 20 to 30 people. These were families, yes, but more than that. They were mutual lifelines. In a world without certainty, every person mattered, every pair of hands, every set of eyes. And when one of those people was injured, aged, or born different, the group faced a choice: leave them behind or make them part of the circle. Again and again, evidence suggests they chose the latter. Bones, that whisper of brotherhood. Archaeology, despite its coldness, its tools, its dust, its long silences, sometimes reveals warmth. Like at Shannidar cave, where a Neanderthal man lived for years despite a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and partial deafness. He wasn't just tolerated, he was kept alive, fed, protected. His people circled around him, not as burdened caretakers, but as companions who understood his life had meaning. Now zoom out from Shannidar, across continents and millennia. We see similar echoes elsewhere. Signs of healed injuries, survival through illness, bodies buried with care. These aren't flukes, they're patterns, and patterns tell stories. The hearth as a social engine. Fire was more than warmth. It was a centre. The hearth was where stories were told, food was shared, tools were passed hand to hand, and around these fires, every member of the group, no matter their ability, had a role to play. A child who couldn't hunt might help gather. Someone with Down syndrome might have brought joy, balance, or ritual importance. In some indigenous cultures even today, individuals with cognitive differences are seen not as lacking, but as touched by the sacred. Could this mindset have ancient roots? Sharing a survival strategy. Anthropological studies of present-day hunter-gatherer societies, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Kung of the Kalahari, show deep traditions of sharing, not charity, but reciprocity. If you had more, you gave. If you were sick, others fed you. It wasn't kindness as luxury, it was survival as a team sport. And within that system there was space for the slowest, the softest, the most dependent. Because those who couldn't hunt might still observe well. Those who didn't speak much might remember paths or patterns, or the way certain plants healed. Community didn't just tolerate diversity, it depended on it. Spiritual value and the other. We often underestimate ancient spirituality. We assume that early humans only worshipped power, the storm, the lion, the sun. But early art and burial practices suggest a more complex emotional world. Was there room in that world for the child who smiled differently? For the elder who spoke to no one, yet always faced the stars? Could people with Down syndrome, gentle, emotionally expressive, often deeply connected to others, have been seen not as lesser, but as luminous? A child born different might have been seen as carrying a message, as a bridge between the known and the mysterious. Conclusion: survival was never solo. It's easy to impose modern assumptions on the past. To picture prehistory as a place of merciless pragmatism, where weakness meant doom. But the bones don't agree. The burial sites don't agree. The warmth around ancient hearths, captured in pollen grains, in soot, in curled sleeping positions, doesn't agree. Our ancestors didn't survive by rejecting the vulnerable. They survived by carrying them. In doing so, they carried something else too, something even more fragile and important: humanity. Rethinking primitive, were they more human than us? We often use the word primitive as a synonym for savage, as if early humans were crude, violent creatures, barely more than animals operating on instinct alone. We imagine them grunting in caves, driven by hunger and fear, incapable of nuance or empathy. But what if that narrative is wrong? What if the real brutality came later? For generations, anthropology assumed that ancient societies left the vulnerable behind, that compassion was a luxury only modern humans could afford. But now the bones are telling a different story. Not just stories of wounds, but of healing. Not just of death, but of care. In burial sites from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, we find skeletons with clear signs of disability, malformed limbs, signs of disease, genetic conditions or trauma that would have required assistance to survive. Yet these individuals lived, not just days or weeks, but years. In the case of the child of La Noguera, they were cared for long enough to grow teeth, develop bone structure, and participate, however limitedly, in a community. So what does that mean? It means that empathy did not begin with civilization, that compassion is older than cities, older than writing, older than religion, that what makes us human may not be fire, or tools, or language, but the quiet choice to help someone who cannot help themselves. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Some of these ancient communities may have been more accepting of difference than modern ones. Today, in a world of advanced medicine and global awareness, people with Down syndrome still face stigma, exclusion, and even institutionalization. Families are pressured, choices are judged. Entire lives are often shaped not by the condition itself, but by how society responds to it. Now compare that to a Neolithic village, 5,000 years ago. No books, no hospitals, no diagnosis. Just a group of people, farmers, parents, siblings, who saw a child born different and chose to keep them close, to feed them, to protect them, to love them. Why? Maybe because they recognized that all life had value. Maybe because in a small, tightly knit group, every person mattered. Or maybe, and this is the hardest truth to admit, they didn't see difference as something to be fixed, feared, or erased. They simply accepted it. That doesn't mean prehistoric life was easy. It wasn't. Survival required constant effort. But that makes their compassion even more extraordinary, because helping someone who slows you down when the world is already dangerous, that's not just kindness, that's a radical human choice. So perhaps we need to rethink our assumptions, to stop using primitive as an insult, because maybe, just maybe, they were not less human than us, but more. In the flickering shadows of ancient hearths, in the hollowed earth of long-forgotten graves, we catch glimpses of a deeper humanity, one that did not separate the strong from the weak, the able from the disabled, the useful from the loved, one that knew that to care is not to fall behind, it's to rise together. And maybe, in some quiet way, they're still teaching us, through bones, through silence, through the enduring echo of empathy, not primitive, just profoundly human. Why this matters today. This isn't just about bones and burial sites. It's not just about dusty skulls unearthed from the soil, or the delicate measurements of femurs and jawbones on lab tables. It's not just about identifying anomalies in dig strands or piecing together fractured skeletons. At its heart, this story isn't about the past at all. It's about now, about us. Because when we ask, how are people with Down syndrome treated in prehistoric times? We're really asking a deeper, more uncomfortable question. How do we treat them now? And the truth isn't always kind. Modern society, with all its medicine and technology, still struggles with acceptance. People with Down syndrome face discrimination, reduced access to healthcare, educational limitations, and social exclusion. In some countries, prenatal diagnoses lead to termination rates so high that individuals with Down syndrome are nearly erased before they're born. We cloak it in language, quality of life, burden of care, medical complexity, but underneath it lies a cold calculation. Who is worth investing in? And yet, 5,000 years ago, before hospitals, before ethics boards, before inclusive policy documents, a small child with Down syndrome lived for several years among their people. They were not discarded. They were not left behind. They were not hidden. Someone carried them, fed them, sat beside them through fevers, watched over them as they slept. Someone loved them. That is the legacy buried with the child of La Noguera. That is the message left in the healed bones of Shannidar I. That is the quiet revolution in archaeology. We are discovering that early humans were not only survivors, they were caregivers. Empathy is not modern. Compassion is not a product of civilization. In fact, it may be the very thing that made civilization possible. This matters because it changes how we see our ancestors and how we see ourselves. For generations, textbooks painted early humans as violent, selfish, and crude. Brutality was assumed. Kindness was an exception. But now, bit by bit, the evidence is revealing another story. That cooperation, inclusion, and love were not rare. They were necessary, they were human. And this matters because history is a mirror. If a Neolithic child with Down syndrome could find a place in a prehistoric village, what does it say about modern cities where children are institutionalized or segregated? If a Neanderthal with a crushed leg and failing sight could live to old age, what does it say about the way we talk about burdens today? If our ancestors could choose care over convenience, protection over abandonment, can we still claim to be evolving? This chapter, then, is not a conclusion. It's an invitation to rethink what we mean by advanced, to question the ways we measure worth, and to understand that being human has never meant being perfect. It has always meant being together. Because in the end, archaeology doesn't just unearth bones, it unearths us, who we were, who we are, who we still might become. The oldest kindness. Before medicine had a name, before ethics had textbooks, before laws protected the vulnerable, there was a choice, a quiet choice, made not in speeches but in small repeated actions, food shared with someone who could not hunt, shelter extended to one who could not build, a place kept warm for a child who would never grow strong. And this choice, this deliberate decision to care, may be the earliest and most enduring marker of what it means to be human. We often measure the greatness of civilizations by their tools, their monuments, their wars. But perhaps the real measure lies not in what they built, but in whom they refused to leave behind. In caves and graves across the world, from the rugged cliffs of northern Spain to the ancient soil of Shannidar, archaeologists are uncovering not just skeletons, but stories. Stories of people who lived with conditions that should, by all harsh logic, have been fatal, and yet they lived. Not just days or weeks, but years. Long enough to form bonds, long enough to matter. Their survival was not accidental, it was intentional. It meant someone slowed their pace for them. It meant someone gave up scarce resources. It meant someone saw them, not as burden, but as belonging. This is not sentiment. It is science, etched into bone and burial. It is data wrapped in compassion, and it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions of ourselves. In a world richer, safer, and more advanced than any our ancestors could have imagined, how often do we still treat difference as weakness? How often do we build systems that exclude instead of include? How often do we forget that the foundation of our humanity was laid not with weapons or walls, but with kindness? The oldest kindness did not come with applause. It came with dirt under fingernails and calloused hands. It came in the quiet dignity of care, in the belief that worth is not earned by strength alone, but simply by being. To find traces of this in deep time, in the lives of those long gone, is not just to rewrite history. It is to reclaim something essential. Because if we are to move forward, as societies, as species, we must remember what brought us this far. It wasn't dominance, it wasn't conquest, it was interdependence. It was the hand that reached back for the one who stumbled. It was the fire shared when wood was scarce. It was the village that saw a child not as broken, but as part of the whole. So when we look back into the caves, the bones, the echoes of a world without words, we see something astonishing. We see love, and in that love we see ourselves. Not as we are told to be, but as we once were, and perhaps, if we choose it again, as we could be.